going to hear from another of the great North Carolina software entrepreneurs and beyond software these days. But I told you I've known Bob since the early 1990s. I actually knew Chris since the earlier mid-1980s. I'm trying to remember 83 or 4, something like that.
I'd have to have been 84 to start.
84. So he was a student here in electrical and computer engineering, and he and one of his fellow students, Bill Nussey, and a couple of other guys whom I had met at some point, but really they didn't come to NC State, so I didn't know them as well. But one, Matt Acco, his dad is actually the head of the history department here. And any of you going to Silicon Valley next month? It's still being worked out, but I think we're actually going to meet up with Matt in Silicon Valley. So
nice. He's
actually doing a new VC firm doing big data companies and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds pretty cool. And Paul Ramsey.
Yeah.
I don't know Paul, but I know his brother who's around, and he's been engaged with us sometimes. But I have to tell you, the whole start of what became the Engineering Entrepreneurs Program and now the Entrepreneurship Initiative, Bill and Chris were the real early inspirations that I had for that led me to decide that this is something that we needed to do at NC State. Because these were guys that came in and they would come into my office and they would talk for long hours about their dreams and aspirations. Remember, this was, you can't remember because you weren't born yet, probably.
Thanks for that.
But around 1984 timeframe, I mean, that was, the IBM PC had come out in '82, and the Apple computer was out, and we're at a point in the history that, these things, computers, which used to be behind big glass walls and accessible only to a few people who had lots of training and there were only a handful of jobs, all of a sudden, computers were accessible to young people like Bill and Chris, and bright young people who could think out of the box and figure out things that people hadn't thought about to do with these things. And I remember, Chris, you all came and you talked about ideas, but it wasn't so much the ideas, it was what you wanted to accomplish something big. I mean, you talked about Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and I remember one day when you came in and you guys had bought an Apple Lisa, precursor to the Macintosh.
We're gotten our hands on one.
You got one? Okay, so
I
maybe
wouldn't
not
say we bought it exactly.
And but the coolest thing was that they were doing contract work, right, for different people to on PCs and stuff, and they somehow got connected with IBM. And I don't know how you guys got connected with IBM, but Chris is a musician, all right? And in addition to being a tech guy, he's a musician. And IBM, I'm hoping I'm not stealing too much of the story.
This story was never going to come up. So
okay, well, it's a cool story, so bear with me on this. So, if you've ever seen one of the very early IBM PCs, they could beep, all right? Now they can play music and high fidelity, stereo, surround sound, and all this stuff. But back then they had a speaker and they could beep, and they just beeped. But they could also beep if you got down to the low-level assembly language in different tones, because it was a little software that controlled how fast the thing, vibrated the speaker, right? So you could control the tone of the beep. And so what these guys, IBM had this big customer center here, and they would bring in people from Citibank and Merrill Lynch and all this stuff and show them their PCs in the customer center. And IBM had come out with the Token Ring, which was a competitor to Ethernet, right? Anybody of you heard of Token Ring?
Goes in and you only have one at a time.
Yeah. And it's supposed to be a superior technology, but superior technologies don't always win. Ethernet, obviously, as you know, won. But IBM asked them to come up with something that they could bring customers in to and if I'm telling this wrong, Chris, you can correct me, because I'd really like to know the right story, but this is the way I remember it. And they had this big stage full of PCs connected with token ring adapters, and they'd written software to make a symphony on those PCs, all beeping different tones. And I remember you guys came in after that. It was a big hit, right? It was a big thing. And you said, you know, it's sort of like Bob saying, who's going to pay for this? You said, you know, it was very cool and they loved it, but none of these guys from Citibank and Merrill Lynch are going to pay for software to make their computers all in their office beep different tones and make music in the background. But then they said, you know, we think there's a really cool thing that you could do with PCs that are connected in an office with this token ring network, and that is sending messages, email. Very cool idea.
Yeah.
And they did.
And then there was spam, but
I
before
know it was
that, it was
spam, actually.
So-
Now I hate you, Chris.
Yeah, yeah. up
Email's
until
the
that
bane
point.
of my
And-
existence.
Yeah, so, and that was, it was kind of a collaboration where, in this case, it was really, they'd arranged 5 PCs in a piece of furniture, and every time one played a note, there was they had like lights in this box. They paid $5,000 for us to write it, and they spent $100,000 on the piece of furniture they put in. Sort of made me wonder how did that work out. But yeah, I mean, so one of the guys we basically wrote a musical language. So I would create, and it was pretty simple, but it was just on any given line, it was saying what note it should be playing, you know, in 5 different tab positions. And then it would just run through and play it, but I could create different songs. So we could, if they wanted another song, they had to buy that from us. We would sell them at add-ons. But the thing that they wanted to show off was, at the time, the problem with the Ethernet was that if there was ever a break in the Ethernet, if you ever put another machine on it, if you unplug something off the Ethernet, everything else would go down. So it was not very fault tolerant at all. It was very primitive. And so the thing with the token ring is it was supposed to be a lot more stable. And so while the song was playing with these 5 computers, what they wanted to show was that they could, you had where all of them were plugged in was in the front of the furniture, and they wanted to unplug one, and the others would keep playing, and they would plug it back in, and it would, you know, it would sync back up and start back up and keep playing again. And it was a very compelling visual. I remember seeing this thing where it all worked together. The only problem with it was that IBM software didn't actually work that way. They wanted it to be demoed that way, and so we had Paul, who was, you know, really the sort of the ninja programmer, got down into the hardware layer and figured out how, once you unplugged it, it was pretty much dead, and when you plugged it back in, we pretty much found a way to hack it back to life when you plugged it back in our little program. But people would come home from their office and they'd go and they'd say, hey, you didn't know the token ring would do this, and they'd unplug somebody's computer off the network and it would just die. Right? And it just wouldn't come back to life at all. But, I mean, the thing with that particular case, though, and I think there's a few things that, just in terms of entrepreneurship, to pass on. That's about, I think the first thing I know about entrepreneurship is that it's a long sequence of figuring out how to get the next thing done. Particularly if you're doing what I think you guys want to do, and what I enjoy doing, which is sort of doing something that nobody's ever done before. You know, you're going into a business, let's say you're going into email, right? So, yeah, how do you get into commercial software? How do you price it? What features are there supposed to be? I mean, we created a paperclip icon for attaching documents to email, it may sound kind of obvious, but that was sort of one of our little surviving meager contributions to it. Blind copies and other things like that. We're just trying to figure out, okay, what would it look like? How would people use it? So there's always this process of figuring out what's the next hard thing you have to get done, and how am I going to figure out how to get that done? And at the moment, we were trying to figure out how to sort of keep paying the rent and keep this little merry band together, and some of that involved finding jobs that we could pay people to do while we figured out what it is that we wanted them to do in the long run. And so one of these is doing this little job for IBM, right? So, you know, it's not, the IBM project wasn't in itself the purpose. It got us some hardware for us to learn how to do other things with. It got us some expertise. And it kept our merry band together until we could get on to the next thing. I mean, there was a time as well, we wrote, and it scares me every time I think about it, but we wrote a custom Windows-based emergency response system for a nuclear power plant in Louisiana, where they wanted to be in Windows, and it would, like all the fire departments and everything else, if there was a nuclear reaction, had to, by law, every 20 minutes essentially report in what their status was, and it all had to kind of compile into a central command center. And they wanted that to run on Windows, which was a terrible idea at the time, but you know, any port in a storm, and you know, we were willing to write custom Windows software, and we had this email thing, so that we seemed more appropriate than other people, and off we went, writing the software where we were sort of pursuing keeping the bills paid, but we could get everything else going. So sometimes the next thing to get done is how do you pay for it? Some things it's a marketing thing, or it's a technical challenge, or how do I find the other person on my team that knows how to do the thing that I don't know how to do? But it's really just, it's a long chain of problem solving. And I guess that's, and that's part of what I enjoy about it, is I enjoy puzzles a lot, and I enjoy, and I think it's in engineering, and you know, why I think that entrepreneurs and engineers, there's a big connection between them, is that a lot of what engineers do is they take things apart and they figure out how they work, and they like to sort of solve the problem of what do you have to do, what do you have to change in this to make this work, to meet the demands of the environment I'm trying to fit it in. I also, engineers are by and large systems thinkers, right? What makes a given system sustainable? What makes it keep running and not breaking down? And what's the most efficient way for that system, given its inputs and the tools I have handy to build it with? You know, what's the most efficient way to make it? And I think it's a way of thinking about things. I mean, I was never, I fell into electronic and computer engineering because I knew I was going to state, and I'd heard that was the toughest thing to take. So I figured I'd start there and then sort of work my way down to whatever I could actually pass. And you know, but I didn't really know what an engineer was. I think a very poor idea of what that was actually about. You know, I was in electrical engineering, and I was disappointed. By the third year, I still didn't know how a TV worked, and that, you know, it just, I felt like there was a lot of stuff that I was supposed to know. I couldn't repair a vacuum cleaner or anything. You know, now what I understand is that it does have more to do with those systems and how you think about systems. And really about everything I do now comes back to that. I mean, in a way, I'm an engineer. I'm just not an engineer of physical things at all. If I'm trying to build a company, or if I'm trying to analyze an existing company and say, okay, what parts of this system are sustainable, are well designed, and what parts of this system lack, you know, where are the design flaws in this? It all kind of comes back to that same kind of engineering thinking. So the stuff that you're doing here along that line, you're not necessarily going to use it the way that you may expect to use it, but it does apply. It does, that thought process, I think, does come in very handy. Something that I think Bob and I have in common. So, you know, for me, there was a team of 4 of us, and we all sort of started out as programmer types. But I had better English skills. And I think I was interested in programming, but not necessarily at the level of detail that they were. And so I really became more of the communications, you know, sales and marketing person of what we were doing.